ahead and be turning to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. That's where we're going to be this morning. We'll be working on finishing up the book of James. I noted on Wednesday, I'll go ahead and note again as a reminder. I'm not going to hand out all the outlines for Peter at the beginning, nor am I going to hand them out necessarily a week ahead of time. My plan right now is to hand out the outlines as we get to each chapter, or they'll be on the board if I don't have them. Forget to put the paper copy down. But as I said Wednesday, I've had all too many chapters that I've gotten to. I've worked on. I like my outline. I printed it out and gave it to everybody. And I was getting ready on Friday, Saturday. I thought, there's a better way to outline this that I think makes the chapter clearer. And instead of me giving you an outline and thinking there's a better one, I'll wait. Doesn't mean I'm not going to find a better one sometime down the road, but at least for that moment, whatever outline we'll deal with as we go. So I'll hand those out. So you just have questions over Peter. What I did, I put a few more questions in there than we've had before, since all you have is questions. Those questions are on the back table under the picture board where we normally keep the outlines. And so questions for the introduction, a couple of introductory questions of the book, and then over chapter 1 of 1 Peter are on that table under the picture board. And then depending on how we get today, if we finish James, then we'll start that on Wednesday. If we don't finish James today, then we'll wrap that up. And probably what we'll do, if we don't finish James today, is we'll wrap up and then we'll finish up whatever we have, and then we'll do a review on Wednesday. So that way we can have a whole class to get started in our introduction of 1 Peter. Introduction in chapter 1 of 1 Peter. But for this morning, we're going to be finishing up, or at least working towards finishing up the book of James in James chapter 5. But since we may finish this morning, I do want to spend just a minute reviewing the earlier part of the book. The book of James itself is about being a doer of the word. As we've said, I think each class, at least most of them, if not all of them, the key verse is chapter 1 and in verse 22, but be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. The book of James divides down into 3 sections. As we outline the book, the first is overcoming trials of faith. That's chapter 1 through 18. Then the majority of the book is about living faith. That is how it looks in our everyday walk of life. That's 1:19 through 5:6. Really, I could run it through the end of chapter 4. I'm going to get to chapter 5, 1-6 in a minute. I don't know what category to fit it under. I'll explain why in a minute. But be a doer of the word. Do not be partial. Have faith with works. Control your tongue. Have wisdom. Draw near to God and rely on God. Those are all the things that are dealt with in these chapters. Chapters 2 through 3 each have 2 of those. Don't be partial and have faith with works. It's chapter 2. Chapter 3, control your tongue and have wisdom. Chapter 4, draw near to God. And then the section on relying on God there at the very end. We're in chapter 5 this morning. It's the end of that section on relying on God. And then into this section on faith triumph from 5:7 through 20. Where it talks about how faith is patient, it prays for others, and it works to restore those who are erring in chapter 5. Now to chapter 5 itself, chapter 5 I would simply title Be Patient. The reason is, I think the focus is on verse 7. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until he receives the early and latter rain. And so I think that's the main theme of this chapter. Now, I'm going to spend a minute here dealing with, I said this first section, which is a warning to the rich. I don't know what category to put it in. We have it in the section on relying on God, because I think there's some practical lessons on relying on God we learn from this. But there is a question that is raised about 1-6. And the question is, and you may read commentators divided over this, is the 1-6 considering rich brethren who are not what they need to be? We have some brethren in James that aren't what they need to be, we've been dealing with. Or is the people of James 5, 1-6 not necessarily him saying, now you that are rich of the brethren, here's what you need to do, but saying, giving a warning and an encouragement in light of the fact that there are some, it seems, who are rich, who are oppressing the brethren in James. And so those are the two questions. I tend to think that it's probably that what he's considering in 1-6 is the people oppressing those that he's writing to. If you go to verse 4, and we'll come back and discuss this all again later, but here's the reason for this. Go to verse 4. Indeed, the wages of the laborer who mowed your field, which you kept by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in luxury, in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. And so what's under consideration in 4-6 is really about these rich oppressing those who are poor, it would seem, in 4-6. And I'll come back and discuss that more later on, but I bring it up now because if you go back to chapter 2, remember this in chapter 2. Remember in chapter 2, in the section on not showing partiality, James pointed out to them how they need to listen, my beloved brethren. Has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? We called that section in our division there, you look over the one who may be more likely to obey. Here's the poor person. They may be more willing to listen than the rich. And the reason is, look at verse 6, but you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme the noble name by which you have been called? And so we already know there's some oppression, going back to chapter 1, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. And so he tells them about trials and wisdom and having perseverance, or another word that perseverance is sometimes translated is the word patience, that we're going to get to in verse 7. Then in chapter 2, he talked about how there were the rich who were oppressing them and dragging them into the courts. And so we know from chapter 2 they're being oppressed and dragged into the courts. So the rich they're under oppression, and it seems there's oppression from the rich. Now, we come to chapter 5. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Is he talking about rich brethren, or is he talking about the rich of this world who are oppressing them? Again, I think it's the rich that are oppressing them. That's why he says, therefore, verse 7, be patient. The word patient, we talked about it a few weeks ago in our series on the Christian graces, is the idea of having perseverance or endurance. And so it seems what's under consideration in this chapter is 1-6 is, here's the oppression the rich are pouring on you. Now, 1-6 is issuing a warning to those that are rich. This is what's going to happen to them. But it's not necessarily as much that he's writing to the rich and saying, here's the problem, as he's giving this warning to the rich to remind those poor that they're oppressing, here's what happens to them. They're oppressing you, but those riches are going to fade. But you be patient and endure the oppression and everything you're undergoing. That seems to be what's under consideration here in James chapter 5. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at what he says. This warning to the rich, again, I think it's the rich that are oppressing them, but these warnings are true no matter who the rich are. What he's going to tell them is the warning, but we'll tie it in when we get to verse 7 to the application there he gives to them. Verse 1 begins with pointing out that to the rich, misery is coming upon you. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. The rich, it seems, that are being dealt with here and again. Keeping in mind that I think that they're not those that are their brethren here that are rich, but those that are oppressing them, they sit back in their riches, as he points out later in verse 5, you fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You lived on the earth, they lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. They're kind of setting back as if, well, everything's well and fine. Look at everything I have, much like the rich fool. And he's reminding them in verse 1 that misery is coming upon you. Now, part of that misery that's going to come, when we get later on in chapter 7, or verse 7 beginning, I'm going to talk about enduring till Christ's return and being patient. Part of that's going to be they're going to obviously suffer eternal punishment for that. But part of the misery coming upon them and the reminder to them is that the riches are something perishable. They're putting their stock in something that's not going to endure. Lord willing, when we get into 1 Peter here in the next week or two, in chapter 1, he's going to talk about the fact that we have an inheritance that's incorruptible, undefiled, and fadeth not away. By the way, here's a hint for you. That's the answer to one of the questions in 1 Peter that you got when you pick up the questions. So he's reminding, we have this inheritance that doesn't fade away, but what the people of James are focused on here is something that perishes. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. The English Standard Version would say, your riches have rotted, or have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Here's the things that you're putting your stock in, but they're rotting. They're fading away. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. So, what he's reminding them of again in 2 and 3 is, you're putting your stock in these riches, but what it leads to is misery. Because these riches that you're putting your stock in, that's something that's temporary. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount about our treasures? That our treasures are to be in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Versus he talked before about those who put their trust in the things of this earth where the moth and rust do destroy. Or again, using the terms here, they are corrupted or corroded and moth-eaten. Those riches are perishing. Those are something temporary. The rich are setting back, putting their stock in them, as we'll see again in a minute in verse 5, fattening themselves on these things, but they're putting their stock in things that do not continue on. Those are eventually going to cease. Yes?
Think about, today, a lot of people are against corporate America. They say, well, they didn't pay the people what they owed or whatever. We look at that, because you basically hired somebody to perform a task. But I'm going to expand on this a little bit. What about if I'm a member of the Church of Christ? And have I held back the wages of the labor? You labor here for us, Micah, in the Word. You labor in the Word. Well, 1 Corinthians 9 says, do you not know that they which minister about the holy things live above the temple, and they which wait at the altar are protectors of the altar? Even so the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live the gospel. And what I'm saying is, every first day of the week, we have the opportunity to lay by and store. We don't have the opportunity, we have the command to do that. And if I'm not supporting the work here as I can, then in a sense I'm holding back your wages, Micah, and I'm going to answer to God for that.
I think you go back to it, and the stock and riches that, and talking about the contribution, and I think about the widow and the 2 mites who gave very little from a monetary standpoint, but a lot in terms of what she had. That you're right about I think when we think about contribution and stuff, it comes back to like these people here. Let's suppose for a second they are brethren. I don't think they are. Some do. I think the point you're going to come to is ultimately, the lessons you're going to take away are ultimately the same. I think your interpretation of the 7 through the end is going to be slightly different. But if it was brethren that he's dealing with here, and there were some, as you go back through the Scriptures, even in the Old Testament, that were well-to-do, the reason that Abraham is somebody pleasing to God versus somebody like the rich young ruler is because of his focus on what he did with the things that he had versus focusing on storing things up for himself. Verse 4 now. The happiness that is the happiness of these rich is because of their oppression of the poor. They're not just happy because of riches. Their happiness seems to be on the fact that they have so much they can use it to oppress others. Indeed, the wages of the laborer who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. They're those crying out who they had oppressed by holding something back from. Verse 4, depending on your translation, I've got the New King James in front of me on my iPad. It says, the Lord of Sabaoth. Now, the first time you read that, the first time you ever opened up the Bible and read that passage, you might have thought they misprinted Sabbath. It's not a term we use often, Sabaoth. It just says Lord of Hosts. That's what the ESV translates it. Is Lord of Hosts. That's what Lord of Sabaoth is. He's the Lord of Hosts. So their cry has reached the Lord. It's reached the Lord of Hosts. Verse 5, you've lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You've fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. What he uses in verse 5 is the illustration almost of the fattening of a calf or the fattening of a pig, the fattening of some type of cattle. You get ready to take some animal to slaughter. and you're going to try to fatten it up. You're going to take it to have for meat. You fatten it up before you take it to slaughter. Why? So there's more meat on it. And what he's saying is they're setting back, living on these things as if they're fattening themselves like you'd fatten the animal for the day of slaughter, setting back, putting their stock in these things. Verse 6, you have condemned, you have murdered the just, he does not resist you. Condemning and murdering the just, again, not necessarily, I think even going back to chapter 4, we talked about murder. I don't think necessarily murdering in the sense that they've actually committed murder, but their lack of love, as we'll see in our lesson here in the next hour about brotherly kindness or brotherly love, a lack of love or hatred is compared to murder. Here are people that didn't love other people, but instead loved themselves and loved their riches and have mistreated others. So verse 7, therefore be patient. And that's what 7 through 11 is dealing with. Now again, as I said, your lessons you're going to take away from the chapter, depending on your interpretation of 1 to 6, is going to come out the same place. In terms of, we go back to 1 to 6, you know what I learned from that? I don't need to put my trust in riches. Whether he's talking to brethren or he's talking about those that were oppressing them, I still learn from that. I don't need to put my trust in riches. So the lesson we're going to get to is the same. The lessons 7 through 11 are going to be the same. But the reason I say your interpretation will be slightly different is I think verse 7 is said in light of whatever's in 1 to 6. Again, we've talked about this before. We talked about it on Wednesday. We talked about it last Sunday morning. He starts with the word therefore. So whatever he's just said has been setting up whatever he's about to say. So let's go back to 1 to 6. The rich, they put their stock in riches. They trust in those riches that are corrupt, those riches that are going to fail. That's where they're putting their stock. So therefore, be patient or endure. And again, I think when you take in mind what's said in chapter 1 and said in chapter 2, you, that is the brethren James is writing to, are being oppressed by those who are rich. Maybe some of these brethren are the ones who mowed the field and their wages were held back. They were, chapter 2, some of them drug into courts by them. But those people are focused on things that are temporal. But you, therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. That is, you endure. All of this oppression you're undergoing, those people are going to give an account for what they've done, but you endure it. If that's what you're going through and you're being put to the test and suffering it, you endure to the very end. Endure until Christ's return. See how, verse 7, the farmer waits for the fruit, for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until the early and latter rain. So he gives a command in verse 7 to be patient, and then it illustrates that. If you plant a field, you may plant a field, and you may go through a lot of hardships. You plant a field, and then you know what? There was a late frost. Or you plant a field, and there was some other problem. You know, maybe there was a storm that came or something that caused some damage to the crop or something. And in order to reap the benefits of that, you're going to have to endure through some of that and be patient until the day that the crop comes forward, right? It's not instant. And you've got to endure some hardships along the way. He uses that to illustrate the point that as Christians, we've got to persevere through some difficulties. Christ isn't coming yet. We're going to wait. We're waiting for that day. We should be eagerly waiting for it. 2 Peter 3. But we look for that day, and we patiently endure whatever we have to undergo until the return of Christ. Yes?
Think about all these things, whether it's suffering, whether it's maybe being the ones that are being oppressed with these rich, whatever the case may be, physical suffering. Any of these things, if we frame it, you know, within the eyes of looking at eternity, that's what's going to help us to endure these things. If we're just looking today, there's a chance that we may not endure through this type of treatment, things like that. But if we can simply look at it through the eyes of how this is going to work in eternity, then that's what's going to embolden us. And if the rich man and Lazarus, if you can talk a little bit now, the rich man would certainly tell us that, you know, don't come here where I'm at. We know that from the Scripture. And we can learn by his wisdom. And then Solomon said all these things are vanity, all these things are of a temporal nature. If we can look at that, then that's going to help us get through this and do it the right way.
No, you're absolutely right. And as you, we tend, if we focus on eternity, and we focus on those things, you're saying, then it makes it easier to endure now. It becomes a lot more simple when we focus on that right area, because we've taken something that, I guess to put it this way, I guess not that it's necessarily simple. It's when we focus on the right things, an impossible task, what seems impossible becomes easier because our focus is on God. Because we're not going to make it on our own. And when we focus in the right area, everything else is going to fall into place. No, you're right. That focus, all coming back to wherever that focus is. I think about where Jesus talks about the greatest command, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. Well, what does it say, all the law and the prophets? You find me a command that if we violate it, does not either mean we, A, do not love God like we should, or B, do not love our neighbor like we should. You're not going to find one. It falls back under one of those two categories. And so when you take that things fall into place. When our focus is there, everything else is going to sort of fall into place. Behind that. So we've got to be patient and focus on that reward to receive that reward. So verse 8 now and verse 9, what are the requirements of that patience? What are the requirements to have that endurance? Well, you also be patient, establish your hearts. So it takes the establishment, or Leonidas says that word means to strengthen of your heart, strengthening your heart or establishing it. When our heart is established in the Word of God and focused on the right things, then what's going to result is living in a proper manner that's going to help us persevere or endure it. Remember, the coming of the Lord is at hand. I think it's part of it. For the coming of the Lord is at hand. That helps us establish our hearts. I don't know when it is going to be. It could be today. It could be tomorrow. It could be 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now. I don't know. But I know this. It's closer now than it's ever been. And if there's a tomorrow, no matter when it is, it's closer to tomorrow than it will have ever been before. So remember that the coming of the Lord is at hand, and when we live in light of that return being at hand, which causes us to endure. If you think it's off in the future, you might think, you know what, I'm not going to put up with the oppression of the rich. And then what I'm going to do is later on I'm going to change. But when you live in light of the fact that the coming of the Lord is at hand, that causes you to live now for Him, so that later on you can reap the reward.
Yes. Think about what we just looked at, bringing it forward again. We put the emphasis sometimes on this little thing called the vapor, when we should be putting the emphasis on eternity. Now, that's don't mean to say we just neglect the things that we're doing in this little vapor, 80, 90 years, whatever like it, but we keep the vapor right. But the real emphasis on keeping the vapor right will be in light of what I said a minute ago, that eternal thing. So how do we do that? Well, if you're fairly young, you're in your 20s, that may seem like, well, if I live as, maybe several years, keep each individual day of that vapor right. Then if we keep each end of those days that comprise our life, the totality of those, then I'll live the life right before God.
You're right, and again, I think going back to that's the impossible task that sometimes people think of, is how do I live 90 years? How do I live 100 years? How do I live 70? However many years you live, how do I live that long in service to God? First of all, we're not guaranteed to live that long. But secondly, as you were pointing out, a day at a time. If I live right today, and then tomorrow, I worry about living right tomorrow, and then the next day. Now, I may be doing things that set me up for success 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, right? And there may be goals that are off in the future that we set toward, spiritual goals that we set toward. We talked about before, preparing the church for the future. I said before, the time for young men to prepare to be elders is not when you're 45 years old, your kids are almost raised, and you think, you know what, now I'm going to start preparing. No, the time to prepare is before you ever even get married, and choosing somebody that can to help you along the way and making sure to set the goals to raise you. Those things are all set up now for things down the road, may set up things down the road, but in order to get to that down the road, I've got to first live right today and then tomorrow and then each subsequent day. Let's go to verse 9 now. Still dealing with requirements of patience. So we establish our hearts. Remember the coming of the Lord is at hand. Verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Perhaps again, maybe there were some who were tempted to join in the oppression. Maybe they were willing to do something to join in. I don't know. But there was a problem, it does seem here, about grumbling and slandering and complaining about their brethren that takes place an awful lot in this book that he speaks about. He tells them, don't grumble against one another lest you be condemned. It's a reminder, too, if we grumble against one another, we've not endured through everything and we'll be condemned. And then in the end of verse 9, behold, the judge is standing at the door. And I think that's the final reminder. Again, reminding it, just another way of saying Christ's return is coming. The judge is standing at the door, and so you live right in light of the fact that we're going to stand in judgment, and that judgment is coming sooner rather than later. Now, again, we may not know how soon that is, but we have to live as if that judgment's coming now. And so we make those preparations because the judge is standing at the door.
Negative, don't grumble. But I should encourage you. When you're doing the right thing, you know what I'm saying? It's not enough just not to grumble, but I should encourage those people that are, the example that they should.
Absolutely, you're right. And I think going back to before, how we need to establish our hearts, doing that can help in establishing the hearts of others. Let's focus on 10 and 11. We're not going to finish this morning. We're going to get 10, 11, and 12 real quick, and then we'll focus on that 13 to the end and review on Wednesday. 10 and 11, my brethren, take heed the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Two examples he gives. You want to know what patience looks like? Look at the prophets and what they underwent. Look at Job and what he underwent. Those are people who endured or persevered. Let me get to verse 12 real quick so that we can focus on the call to pray and praise. And then restoring the airing and a review on Wednesday. Verse 12, but above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, lest you fall into judgment. So, he tells them not to swear by heaven or earth, but let their yes be yes and their no be no. So, the point he's making, he talks about the swearing or the making of an oath, especially in light of the judgment. And in light of what's been said before, maybe some of them were kind of rash to make some kind of vow in light of judgment. It seems perhaps is what's taking place. And he's reminding them, don't be sitting there making these rash oaths and be swearing, but remember that your word, what you say, ought to be good enough. Let me answer this real quick. Question that comes up. Question has been asked, I've heard a debate before among brethren about... or not a debate, but different side asking this question. What about if I have to testify in court? Well, if you testify in court, you raise your right hand. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. I don't think that's not necessarily what he's talking about. He's talking about you need to let your word be good enough. Now, if you don't feel right doing it, they will allow you to say, I affirm. But I don't think that's necessary, that we're considering the idea of raising our hand or swearing under oath to tell the truth. The point is, if I tell you something, you ought to be able to trust that. I shouldn't have to say, I promise you, or I swear to you. If I tell you I'm going to do this, that word ought to be good enough. You ought to be able to trust my word. Lord willing, on Wednesday evening, we're going to finish up 13 to the end of the chapter and then spend a little bit of time reviewing whatever time we have left. And then next Sunday morning, we'll start 1 Peter.